Welcome to the Doctor Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Continue your learning after the show at www.drjournalclub.com.
Please bear in mind that this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Talk to your doctor before making any medical decisions, changes, etc. Everything we're talking about, that's to teach you guys stuff and have fun. We are not your doctors. Also, we would love to answer your specific questions. On drjournalclub.com, you can post questions and comments for specific videos, but go ahead and email us directly at josh@drjournalclub.com. That's josh@drjournalclub.com. Send us your listener questions and we will discuss it on our pod. Hello and welcome to another Dr. Journal Club podcast. This is your host, Josh and Adam, East Coast Adam, as we call him now. Today we're talking again about statins, and I'll tell you, I'm already getting a little bored with it. But that's okay. We promised we would do the other side of the debate. I don't know if it's a debate. The other side of the coin, I guess.
Based on the last paper, yeah.
Based on the last paper, yeah. So if you don't know what we're talking about, last week we covered a recent paper, I think in JAMA Internal Medicine or something like that, from a Cochrane group about statins, and they focused on absolute effects, and they broke it down out of the composite outcomes. And we talked a lot about the pros and cons of that. And it was somewhat skeptical. I don't know about skeptical, but more just, you need to focus on absolute effects. And if you do, it looks less impressive than most people think. And, have a good informed conversation with your patients. So that was sort of like the real top line summary. But what they were contrasting their position with was this particular individual participant data meta-analysis, an IPD meta-analysis by the Cholesterol Treatment Trialist Collaboration back in 2010 in the Lancet. Not too shabby. And so we thought, to be fair, we should talk about that paper as well. And that is our hope today. And then I am done, Adam. No more statin papers for a while.
Yes, no, I agree. No more statin papers. If you have any beef with statins and you have statin concerns, you're an ostrich putting your head in the sand and refusing to just kind of listen to this status of scientific consensus. I'm sorry.
And we have a lot on, so Adam's not heavy-handed at all. But we do have a lot of information on Dr. Journal Club. I think Adam just did a new Dr. Journal Club, should be released, I think, in either December or January, coming up in a couple months. And we've got continuing ed classes. I think, minus your heavy-handed comments, I think my thought is just like, there's just nothing new. Like, we're just rehashing the same randomized trials, and so like even the paper that we covered last week, it was just talking about the same randomized controlled trials that they talked about in 2010 pretty much. I mean, maybe there were a few extra ones, but this research has been done, and so I feel like the new stuff is more, it's not like it's not up to date, it's just we just don't have new massive randomized trials, to your point, because the evidence is pretty strong.
Yeah, and we don't need to waste any more research on it. It's kind of like vitamin D studies. Like, we keep rehashing the same topic and getting the same result, and then being like, but what about this? But what about that? And then we explore that, and then and we just keep getting the same answer.
So my new I just love the certainty behind Adam's voice today. So my new plan is just to be a needle in his side. And I think I've got a few other secret pod ideas that we could do just to needle him a bit more. So anyway, let's I'm going to play foil to you, sir. There we go. All right. So let's yeah.
Well, before we get into that, do you want to let people know what an IPD is?
Yeah.
And how it's different?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So IPD, or individual participant, sometimes called individual patient data meta-analysis as opposed to a regular meta-analysis, which is referred to as a pairwise meta-analysis, and they are really confusing, so we should talk about them. And I am planning on doing I've been on an IPD meta before, but as like, I don't know, fourth or fifth author or something. But I'm planning one for my PhD program. It's going to be the third of 5 projects I have to do. So we've already kind of started protocol work on that and stuff. So I'm going to be more and more getting into the depths of the methods behind it, but here's the basics of it, which is essentially when you have a standard meta analysis, the unit that you're pooling is the end result of an individual study, right? So, you got a randomized control trial that says take statins, you reduce your risk of death by 20%. That 20% and the variability around it, so usually standard deviations or standard error, is the data point that goes into the meta analysis. But that study might have like, I don't know, 10,000 people with some of these, statin trials, and you're missing all that nuance. And that nuance can be really important because there could be participant level data that matters. So if you're really interested in how women respond to statins versus men, and all the studies are mixed sex studies, you could do this with an IPD because you could go in and get the individual female data and the individual male data and analyze them separately. If you're interested in baseline, it was very relevant here. If you're interested in baseline LDL levels, you can go in and get individual data and cut it up that way. So if you're looking at subgroup analyses and really nuanced questions, your power is extraordinarily limited with the pairwise meta-analysis. So in my PhD project, I'm very interested in the latency of seizures after getting a concussion. And so I'm the theory is I'll be able to go in and get the individual participants' latency, meaning this person had seizures 2 months after the concussion, this person had it 3 weeks after the concussion, and kind of look at the differences there as opposed to having it all be aggregated. So that's the main difference. It is an insane amount of work because you need to reach out to scores of research groups. Sometimes they've done the study like 50 years ago. You need to get the individual data, and like sometimes that's not available, or it's in like 8 tracks and like really really old stuff, especially with the statin trials. And so what these trialists did, which was great, is they're like, we need massive amounts of data on statins to answer these questions because the baseline risk is so low usually, and it takes years and years and years. And so we are going to prospectively create this collaboration. All the different trialists that did these statin studies, we're going to agree to share our data. We're going to agree to do this individual level analysis, and that's what they came out with in the Lancet. So can be very very powerful. You don't see a lot of them just because they're so darn hard to do, and it's hard to get access pragmatically and otherwise to that information. Does that answer the question, you think?
Yeah, I mean, just doing a regular systematic review with meta-analysis is pretty can be daunting, and so to do that with individual data,
Yeah.
if you have 10,000 participants, you got to collect that thing 10,000 times. Whereas if you have
Yeah.
just an aggregate, you just need a couple scores here and there. And you're basically doing like an average of averages if you think about it. Whereas at the individual level, it's you're like recreating the wheel almost.
Yeah, the more I talk about it, the more I'm like, what did I sign up for? But yeah, no, you're right. Like when you do a regular meta, like when you do extraction, I mean, you do all sorts, you extract a bunch of stuff, but essentially you need the result, like the risk ratio, and then like the standard deviation and like the number of people, and that's it.
Mhm.
You know, so this is a whole nother bear. Anyway, so that's what these authors did here, and so do you want to get us started off? You want to kind of talk about the study design a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So what they did was this was again, like we talked about last time, the cholesterol treatment trialists collaboration, and this is a group that's not funded by industry. Everyone here is, just basically working off of grants that they got, public grants, and now the trials they looked at.
Well, is that true? Is that true? I think they.
Oh, some of them get like, some of them are speakers and whatnot and do get paid by industry, but for this study in particular, everything was done through yeah, public like educational grants and whatnot.
Oh, that's a good point. But these are all the trialists from these large studies that were like all funded by the industry. Yeah.
Correct. Yes, yes. The trials themselves were largely funded through industry. However, this particular group, the Cholesterol Treatment Trialist Collaboration, is not receiving funding through industry. So I do think that that's important. Where if you have this, public organization that is making these statements, it's important
Hmm.
to recognize that. But really, what this study design was they looked at 26 randomized trials that consisted of around 170,000 participants.
Crazy, right? And these are randomized trial, 170,000 people. It's insane.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's a lot. And basically, in order to be eligible to be part of this systematic review and meta-analysis, the initial study had to have an intervention where the goal was to lower LDL cholesterol. There had to be no other differences in risk factor modification, and each trial had to have at least 1,000 participants within the trial, and the trial had to be at least 2 years in duration.
So these are all the big boy trials or big girl trials in the statin world.
Exactly, exactly. And the pre-specified outcomes of this meta-analysis in particular was basically, looking at those individual composite major adverse cardiovascular event outcomes. So things like coronary death, non-fatal heart attacks, revascularization procedures, getting a stroke. And they even, subdivided and subdivided and subdivided by that. So there was a lot of things that they looked at, but really from an outcome standpoint, it was a lot of the major vascular events that we care about, right? So heart attacks, strokes, and yeah.
And just to chat about that real quick, because last time we were talking about composite outcomes and casting aspersions on that, but I think your example was, you have these heart attacks and then you throw in like ear pain or something, right? So something random.
Mhm.
But these particular a priori MACEs, major adverse cardiovascular events, I think, I think they were all pretty kosher, right? It was like literally what you said, like stroke, revascularization, death, and MI. Like that seemed fair.
Yeah, it was all things that we cared about. And then when it came to mortality, they actually even looked at all cause mortality, non-vascular related mortality, and then vascular related mortality. So I thought that was really interesting. So it's not just like, oh, do these have life extending properties to these medications just in general, but is there actually a difference between the mortality being from a vascular event or just something completely random? Hmm.
Yeah, and also to that, and we'll probably talk about this later, but to that point, if there were potential side effects that cause death,
Hmm.
and you didn't measure that, right, then that would be kind of important. So, you get the all cut. So you're not just looking at cardiovascular death, which would be the potential benefits of statins. You're also looking at overall death as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this particular study is actually they're building off a prior study that they did where in the prior study they looked at 90,000 individuals from 14 trials, and so this one is effectively double that, right? You're at 170,000 and 26 trials. So, it's not just like, oh, we added one more study. They added a lot more data to pre-existing literature. And
And let's and there was a reason too. So there was new data, but also because there was new data specifically about high dose statins versus low dose statins. Like there was this question. So the background interest was like, we have all this observational study data that okay, so like yeah, we think we've established that statins are good. And now we've got all this observational data that sort of the higher you go on statin therapy, the lower you drive that LDL, the bigger the benefit is. And that's sort of what the purpose of this. And again, something you can only really do with an individual participant data meta-analysis is to say, looking at these, specific LDL lowering levels and weighting and sort of standardizing to that, what is the benefit per unit LDL reduction? And is that continuous? Is it one linear line or does it sort of like bottom out at a certain point or cause harm at a certain point?
yeah, and the way that they reported the results was based on just statins versus routine care,
Hmm.
and then also comparing high intensity statin therapy to lower intensity statin therapy, and seeing if there was a difference with that. And what I thought was the most interesting thing was not only did they report it as, okay, do statins have an effect, but then they standardized it to the amount of LDL reduction.
Yes.
And they standardize it to how much risk reduction do we get per 40 nanograms per deciliter?
Milligrams per deciliter? I think it's milligrams per deciliter. Yeah.
Milligrams per deciliter, yes. Per 40 milligrams of deciliter, which is the equivalent of 1 millimole per liter. The
Which only the silly Brits think about. I think this. Oh, it's a Lancet paper. That's why they talk about millimoles. We were so confused.
Yeah, and there is a calculator that can actually do the conversion for you.
Thank goodness.
But basically, 1 millimole is 40 milligrams per deciliter of cholesterol. And so, for any of our American listeners, whenever you get like a cholesterol panel and they say like, "Oh, your cholesterol down 8 points," they're talking about the milligrams per deciliter. And so they standardize it to, okay, not only are statins beneficial, but if we are truly saying that there is this relationship with the LDL, then we would expect more reduction in risk per unit of LDL that goes down, and so we'll standardize it to that 1 millimole or that 40 milligram per deciliter reduction,
Yeah.
which was actually, in my opinion, really helpful, and it's also kind of like clinically meaningful because
Hmm.
if you have someone you're trying to lower your cholesterol and you're trying to say, well, what's a good number? You can kind of say, well, hey, you're at this number. If we reduce it by another 40 milligrams per deciliter, we might get this additional risk reduction on top of that. So that's I thought that is helpful and just another way of kind of viewing how much benefit we get.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good setup. From like a methods perspective. There's like some complicated stats, but I don't think we need to go into them too much.
No, we definitely don't need to go into that. And then when we look at the results, the average, trial duration, this is pretty standard, was 5 years basically, um, and the baseline LDL, I think it was 2.5 millimole, I think, and then the difference at 1 year across the trials was half a millimole, so about a 20 milligram per deciliter reduction in the LDL at the 1 year mark in these trials.
Hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah. I think when you look at there's more more statin versus less statin, but then also when you look at the statin versus just regular control, yeah, it was like 3.7 baseline LDL. So that, according to the calculators, anyway, that's like 140. So if you had a patient with like 140 level of LDL, that's kind of what these types of patients, and they were mixed. They were primary prevention and secondary prevention patients. And then
Yeah,
I think the LDL difference at 1 year was pretty similar. Oh no, I guess with the statin versus control, it was a whole millimole, so like 40-point reduction.
yeah. And now when we look at like the actual, I mean, I'm ready to move on to like the clinical outcomes. I don't think we have to talk about. Yeah, yeah, no, no.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Let's do vascular.
Yeah. So when we look at really any sort of vascular event, when we look at higher versus lower intensity statin, and one thing that before we get into that, the paper we talked about in the last podcast, they basically said that these authors did not report the absolute effect. They actually did. They just didn't directly say it, and you can see it. It's there in the table. So for anyone who's listening and is looking at this paper, if you look at Figure 1, they look at when they're evaluating any major vascular event from these studies, and we're looking at more higher intensity statin versus less or lower intensity statin. They do show what the absolute risk reduction or the absolute risks were in each group. So in the control group, they had and let's just for the sake of rounding, 5.5% of the participants had some sort of a vascular event. And then in the higher intensity statin group, 4.5% had some sort of a vascular event. And so 5.5 minus 4.5% is 1%. So there's your absolute risk reduction is 1%.
So like a numbers needed to treat of 100, essentially. So you treat for what would you say, 5 years average, higher versus lower statin. you're going to prevent one additional vascular event per 100 people treated if you go higher versus lower.
Yeah. And that's also a combined group, I believe, of primary and secondary prevention. So,
I think these ones, so like overall, yeah, but I think these specifically, yeah, the higher versus lower, those are all secondary prevention.
okay. And then they also showed the relative risk reduction. And what they did was they reported it in two ways. One was an unweighted relative risk reduction in the sense that they're not standardizing for that 1 millimole reduction in the LDL. So they're not standardizing it to anything. And what we're seeing is a 15% risk reduction um, in any major vascular event. When we apply that 15% relative risk reduction to the absolute risk, we end up getting the same thing. We end up seeing that 1% absolute risk reduction. And we talked about that in the last podcast as to how to calculate that as well. So there's nothing that's being hidden. There's nothing that really is being misrepresented here. You just have to be able to recognize that and kind of do some quick math to understand that, and you can see the absolute risk reduction there. So I don't think you should really fault the authors for not directly reporting it. And then when they then standardize it to the unit of LDL reduction, which again is the 1 millimole per liter or the 40 milligrams per deciliter reduction, we see that there's a 28% relative risk reduction in any major vascular event.
Yep, perfect. And then for the statin versus like placebo, statin versus control, as opposed to higher versus lower, just to pick
Mhm.
up the ball, it's a similar story. You have about, if we're just doing round numbers, about a 1% difference in absolute risk reduction. And you have about a 20% reduction in relative risk
Mhm.
reduction. So it's a similar story. I think, we were talking earlier about how we weren't huge fans in how they did the reporting. It was just sort of the message got lost in the weeds, I think. But I think big picture messaging is, if we're talking very round numbers,
Mhm.
with statin trials, you can expect about a 20% relative risk reduction in vascular events over the 5 years, and that translates to a 1% absolute risk reduction. And yeah, 1% absolute risk reduction.
And to add on
Mhm.
to that, per 1 millimole reduction in LDL,
Yes, sorry. Yes. Sorry.
yeah, and that's the biggest thing. Is so
Hmm.
as you get more LDL reduction,
Yes,
that relative risk and absolute risk is
absolutely.
going to
That's right.
increase, and it effectively is going to double. So if you go from 1 millimole, if you're able to reduce it by 2 millimole or by 80 milligrams per deciliter, you can expect a 2% absolute risk reduction, or a 40% relative risk reduction.
Yeah, and I think they were saying, based on the data they had, you could extrapolate it as far as like a 50% relative risk reduction or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, 40 to 50%. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to clarify too. Like, so I think the relative risk numbers are pretty solid. The absolutes that we're talking about, really, so overall, like, that's correct. It's about a 1% difference, but remember that will really depend upon the baseline population. I think some of that's getting lost in this meta analysis. I think the
Mhm.
bigger thing is, yeah, we're talking about a 20% per 40 milligram per deciliter drop, and you should apply that to the baseline risk of your population to really get a sense of the absolute difference.
Yeah. And again, that 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but also look at these event rates. We're talking about a 5 versus 4% difference,
Right. Yeah.
right? So in a control group, you only have a 5% event rate. So if you're expecting a 20% absolute risk reduction, that just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that's the point of the other side. It's like, well, these are rare events anyway, so 20% reduction of a rare event is even rarer. But they kind of suck. Like, the outcomes they're rare, but they suck. So, yeah.
Exactly. So if you're having, it's based on these numbers, it's unlikely to happen, but you don't want them to happen. You want to mitigate that risk as much as possible, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
And then when we're looking at these different outcomes too, we're seeing kind of like across the board similar results of about just basically a ballpark 20% reduction in the risk when you standardize to a 1 millimole or 40 milligram per deciliter reduction in the LDL for just about every outcome.
Yeah, it was interesting, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, and so like, I mean, and that was shown in like not only all of these different outcomes, but then when they said, okay, well, let's look at all these different subgroups, right? People who have
Mhm, mhm.
previous vascular disease versus no vascular disease, people who have diabetes or no diabetes, if they're male or female, what about their age? Okay,
Male, female, ages. Yeah.
you know, all of these other sort of comorbidities that are existing, we're still getting this, ballpark 20%
Mhm.
risk reduction based on that 1 millimole per liter of LDL reduction. And again,
Very remarkable consistency. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and again, that risk continues to get better as you reduce more.
Mhm.
And I believe that, and then they also showed that basically, I think it was in Figure 4, where it didn't really matter what your baseline LDL was either. As long as you achieve that standardization, you're still getting that ballpark 20% risk reduction. So whether your LDL is already like, oh, well, it's already low, I don't think you're going to get that much better. Well, if you lower it by that 1 millimole, that person's baseline risk is going to go down by 20% on a relative basis. If they go from, let's say, 50, if their baseline LDL level is a 50 and you bring it down to a 10, you're still going to reduce their
Yeah, it's
risk.
very interesting. Like, all these different baseline LDL levels. Yeah, very remarkable consistency, all around 20% relative risk reduction, whether you started at greater than 3.5 millimoles, and I don't even know what that is. That's a really high number.
I
Versus
think it was only like 150.
for 3.5 millimoles?
Yeah, I'll look at it. I'll look at it right now.
Yeah, you look it up real quick. Um, I feel like it should be higher than that, maybe not. And then even as low as less than 2 millimoles, you still saw this remarkable, consistent effect, which is very interesting. And their point was like, kind of how low can you go? And they were like, pretty darn low. You just keep on reducing the risk.
There's no threshold really, and the PCSK9 trials also this. By the way, 3 millimoles is 160 milligrams per
Three
deciliter.
is 160. Okay, so like we're talking close to
116.
116. That's it. Oh, okay. All right. All right. You're right. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like 3.5 is 135. And then a four is 155.
So, yeah, no, I think that's the main. I know we'll talk about strokes briefly in a second, but I think that was kind of the main remarkable take home is like pretty much you're talking about a 20% relative risk reduction, and then of course you just need to apply that. And so to just make a quick comparison to the other paper we talked about last week, I think their point is simply, well, if you break it out by individual things and not these composite things like vascular events, it's going to be less impressive. And it's going to be even less impressive when you do that and you talk about the absolute risk difference. And again, to your point, these authors are not giving the absolute risk. It's what people are focusing on essentially. And at the end of the day, if you tell someone you can reduce your risk by 50%, like everyone's going to sign up. But if you then say, well, that's really just, a 1% difference here or 0.8% difference, maybe people will make a different decision. And I think our take home last time was, just present everything to patients and let them make the decision that's right for them with the right information.
Yeah. And just kind of to tie back to what I was saying about PCSK9 inhibitors, those are medications that can lower the LDL to an even greater extent than statins can. And in the two landmark trials that looked at PCSK9 inhibitors, these were people who were already like maxed out on statin therapy. They were already receiving the highest dose. Some receiving the highest dose of a statin plus another cholesterol lowering medication, and then they even added on this PCSK9 inhibitor. And for some people, they got the LDL down into the single digits, and still saw additional risk reduction for cardiovascular events. And that is in line with what this paper is saying. And the PCSK9 inhibitor trials came, much later after this meta-analysis was published. So it's just we're seeing a consistency in the evidence across different types of studies, different types of interventions. as long as they're kind of tying it to the amount of LDL reduction that's happening.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know those studies. That should be something we should talk about in the future, I think for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also for the clinicians out there, the ACC/AHA cardiovascular risk estimator plus calculator will you can put in stuff to calculate their baseline risk, and then you can click on, I think if you scroll down, it says like, view therapy advice, and you click like start statin, it will show what that baseline risk goes down to.
That's cool. So it shows you the absolute the risk difference there. Yeah.
Yeah. And you can show that to a
Mm,
patient of like, hey, your baseline risk is
nice.
15%. If we start a statin, oh, now it goes down to this. Do you want to start it or
So it's like a
not?
calculator and a decision aid too. Helps the patient make those decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a free app on the phone. So
Can you will you send Michelle a link to that and we'll put it in the show notes?
sure.
Okay, cool. Look, the thing is, we don't do this for money. This is pro bono. And quite honestly, the mothership kind of ekes it out every month or so, right? So we do this because we care about this. We think it's important. We think that integrating evidence based medicine and integrative medicine is essential. And there just aren't other resources out there. The moment we find something that does it better, we'll probably drop it. We're busy folks. But right now, this is what's out there. Unfortunately, that's it. And so we're going to keep on fighting that good fight. And if you believe in that, if you believe in intellectual honesty in the profession and integrative medicine and being an integrative provider and bringing that into the integrative space, please help us. And you can help us by becoming a member on Dr. Journal Club. If you're in need of continuing education credits, take our NANCIAC approved courses. We have ethics courses, pharmacy courses, general courses. Interact with us on social media, listen to the podcast, rate our podcast, tell your friends. These are all ways that you can sort of help support the cause. Okay, so there's a few caveats that I think we should talk about. One is you can hear an argument like, okay, Josh, well, as low as you want to go, but what about side effects? At some point, there's going to be a trade off. So, I think there were two things that they came up with from a side effect perspective. One was myopathy, and then the other was hemorrhagic stroke. So let's maybe talk about the myopathy first. You know, I guess
They also look like cancers.
right. Sorry. So they also looked at and there was no cancer signal, right? I don't think they saw
None at all. Yeah, no, none at all.
no cancer signal whatsoever. And then of course all the cardiovascular signals you would have caught with the regular outcomes and death as well. So with myopathy, because you hear that a lot, they did not take that information, which I thought was interesting. They only counted cases of myopathy that progressed to rhabdomyolysis, and that's what they kind of looked at and said, there's no major signal. And I thought that was a little bit, interesting. You know more about the statin world than I do, but that seemed a little uneven handed. And then there's the hemorrhagic stroke discussion we should have. But any comments on the rhabdomyolysis?
Well, I mean, that's the biggest concern, right? Is like, well, this myopathy of just like I'm just not tolerating it, or is this myopathy that's going to cause an emergency? And
Yeah, that's a fair point because it's like if you're, it's like when we did that pod on was it GLP-1s and there's that case report of the patient who was like, oh, it hurts
the
so.
GI adverse effects, yeah.
Yeah, it was a newspaper article. It hurt so bad, and then like they ended up getting gastroparesis, and like the question was, well, like why didn't your doctor tell you to stop, right? And so it's the same here. It's like if you get muscle aches, like okay, stop the statins. But to your point, like the more important issue would be the rhabdomyolysis. Yeah, fair enough. Hmm.
And also, you have to confirm that myopathy is actually happening from the statin, and there is an actual procedure as to how to do that to see if it was the statin.
Hmm.
And there have been really interesting N of one studies where they take like hundreds of people, and each person serves as their own control, and they blind them and do a crossover of like, hey, for the first 6 months, you're going to be taking statin or placebo. We don't know which one it is. You don't know which one it is, but just record your symptoms. And then at the 6 month mark, they'll do a washout period for a couple of weeks where they're not getting anything,
Hmm.
and then they go, they flipped. So those who started on statin were then switched to placebo, and those who started on placebo were switched to statin, and actually asked them, okay, now that you're on this new thing, like record your symptoms. and they actually found that more people on the placebo reported more myopathy events than individuals on the statin.
Oh, interesting.
And then when they asked them, "Would you start a statin after kind of doing this experiment?" more people said, "Yeah, I would."
Once they knew the results. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, of course, like once these signals get identified in like observational studies, obviously it's an important safety signal, but then it gets out there. And then if it was a false flag or false signal rather, then it's in the national psyche and then we're looking for it, right? And so, how much of that? But
Mhm,
yeah, so there's that. And then the hemorrhagic stroke thing was interesting. I don't know that I fully understand the mechanism. Maybe you do. But essentially, the argument was it does overall, there was a benefit on stroke. It's very similar to what we saw across the board. However, once you broke it down between like a clot stroke versus a hemorrhagic stroke, there was a difference in direction. So a lot of benefit from preventing ischemic strokes, but then there was an increase in hemorrhagic strokes. And I think the primary meta-analysis was not statistically significant for that increase, but once they added in data from like a recently published study that didn't meet their criteria in the discussion, they're like it met statistical significance. But I think the main take home is that on net, there were fewer strokes because you're going to have more of these ischemic strokes anyway.
mhm,
But there does seem to be a signal of an increase in hemorrhagic strokes. So, question. Oh, and that was their take home point was like basically all the mechanisms of benefit here relate to, hardening of the arteries or narrowing of the arteries or clots, essentially.
mhm,
And so if your patient is at risk for that, that's when you should think about statins. It's not going to be a cure all for all cardiovascular issues.
mhm.
Um, do you know what the potential mechanism is for the hemorrhagic stroke signal?
I don't know what it is, but I also didn't really like how they kind of reported it in the discussion where they were like,
Uh huh.
they honestly they could have like just reported the data, but instead they threw this like theoretical like pixie dust, excuse
Uh
me.
huh.
Um, and so I was just like, wow, you had this like really in depth paper, and then you just kind of like kind of just kind of chalked it up to, well, theoretically this could happen, but the benefits outweigh the risks, so just like ignore it. And I was like, well, hold on, let's do some due diligence here. Their exact quote is the absolute size of the potential hazard would be about 50 times smaller. And then they say perhaps a few extra hemorrhagic strokes annually per 10,000 treated. Uh, But like they didn't actually quantify it, which I was kind of peeved by. They're like, nah, it's probably this. Like, and then the definite absolute effects of a few hundred avoided per 10,000. So basically, like you were saying, that the benefits of preventing an ischemic stroke so much outweigh that of a hemorrhagic stroke, but they don't actually quantify that is what ticked me off.
Mm-hmm.
But I get what they're saying of like, yeah, yes, that risk is there,
Yeah.
but the amount of risk from an ischemic stroke is so much greater than that of a hemorrhagic stroke occurring because of the statin that the benefits outweigh the risk from a number standpoint.
To your point, like when we were texting about this earlier, I think you said something like, oh, now they're talking about absolute
Right.
effects,
Yeah.
and I thought that was totally fair. And there were a few things, and I think like the muscle pain was another one where I'm like, they're not doing anything like untoward, but there are a few not sleight of hands, but there are a few things where it's spun just a certain way. And I think that was one of them. Like we're focusing super super heavily on this 20% relative risk reduction, and you could take it even further. And every time you drop 40 points and all this, and then it's like hemorrhagic strokes. Oh, now we're talking about absolute risk reductions of like a couple per 10,000 or whatever it is. So I thought that was fair.
I think it's kind of interesting, like how that actually made it all the way through to publication. Because
Mm.
for anyone who's not familiar with the publication process, when you submit a manuscript, like first the general editor of the paper will read it to see if it's even worthy of review, and then if they do deem it to be worthy, they'll have three random people typically read the paper and really nitpick it and just make obscure comments as to like why it shouldn't be published, of like, this comma shouldn't be here, like reject. And
That's
then,
reviewer two usually. Yeah.
yeah, it's almost always reviewer two who always has a comment, and it's usually like reviewer one is like, yep, this was great.
I clearly haven't read the manuscript, but here's all my problems with it. Yeah.
Exactly. So the fact like that comment of like, well, yeah, perhaps like there's a risk there, but just ignore it.
Oh, I have a different take on that. I think I bet well, okay, if I had to put money on it, I would say someone brought it up in peer review, and then they had to deal with it in the discussion. Like, I bet someone's like, "Well, what about this signal here?" And then the editors were like, "Okay, you need to address this," because it's like like, sometimes you'll see like, I know we've done that, like, shove stuff in the discussion, if it's like, "Well, I see what you're saying, but it's not really
Yeah.
how we approach this," and the editor you gotta make the editors happy, so it's like, "I will shove it in the discussion."
Yeah, and by the time too, like your like manuscripts, the sort of like the life cycle of a manuscript is you get all jazzed up for the idea of it. Then you kind of go into like work mode of like doing all the work, and then you write the manuscript, and then it's just like this editing process from hell where you just have like it's like, manuscript one and you save that. And then it's like manuscript one underscore saved,
Underscore final, final 2, final, final.
manuscript one, yeah, final two, final three, manuscript like revised
Yeah.
edits to please peer review editor two. And then you have like 400 different documents of that. And so by the time you finally submit and accept, you're just like, thank God, and you move on to the next one. So you don't even,
It's like a war of attrition. Like, at that point, I don't know about you, when you get to, like, those, like, second round revisions, I'm just like, "Okay, whatever
yeah,
whatever you want, fine. We'll put in discussion. Okay, you wanna talk about that? It's ridiculous, but sure, we'll put in the
yeah,
discussion."
yeah,
It's like, I want this thing to find a home already, like, I'm moving on. It's been, like, a year since we finished this study, like, yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, sometimes when I submit papers, like during that process, I kind of try to put on like a mindset of like, what's something here that's like kind of kosher, but someone would if like they're really reading it would pick it up and comment on it, and then I try to address it that way, so this way they don't have comments to make. Sometimes it
Oh, they
works.
gotta come up with something. I've heard people.
But that's just
Yeah.
but when that happens, it's really annoying. You're like, "You just had to come up with something,
Yeah,
didn't
they have
you?"
to validate, like, I've heard, I don't do this, but I've heard people, like, leave stuff in so that reviewers have something to chew on that isn't substantial, 'cause I feel like people will nitpick until they find something. So, anyways, there's all these different, anyway, I think we're getting on a tangent, but yeah, so I have a feeling that, you're like, either the reviewers were asleep at the wheel, or I'm like, it was reviewer 2 and they had to they had to put it in at the end, but yeah,
Yeah,
okay, so I think that's a good summary of the paper. Like, what's your main, now that we've done 2, and we'll do the PSK stuff later maybe, but, now that we've done these 2 statin papers, and I feel like we have a good sense of the data. It's not like there's, like, massive news. I mean, there's, like, 200,000 people randomized. Like,
yeah.
we have enough information. So what is your major take home from all of this?
Statins work. Statins reduce risk of cardiovascular events. If you use statins and base it on the amount of cholesterol reduction you're getting, you can assume about a 20% reduction in the risk per millimole of LDL reduction, or per 40 milligrams per deciliter reduction in the LDL, which translates to a couple points from an absolute standpoint. And the overall benefits from them outweigh, or at least they seem to outweigh, associated risks. And that main risk being myopathy and some signal regarding hemorrhagic strokes. And there does not seem to be any sort of signal for causing cancer.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I'd probably caveat with, like almost all of medicine, it works, but it just doesn't work very much. And yeah.
Yeah. And one thing though that I do think is interesting is, even though we're standardizing it to the LDL reduction,
Mhm.
it seems that perhaps we're not getting that with other interventions that also reduce LDL,
Oh, say more. What do you mean? What do you mean?
right? So, like, if you're looking at like let's say niacin reduced LDL by 40 points. We don't have any trials that actually support niacin for the prevention of cardiovascular outcomes.
But wait, meaning we don't have negative data either. We just don't have the data.
For the two trials I know, they just did not show any sort of benefit with use, even though they did reduce LDL and increased HDL. And so, now do we need a niacin trial that's standardized to like a millimole reduction in LDL before we can actually throw that out? But statins are really the main intervention that actually prevent cardiovascular events.
Well, that yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, like, to play devil's advocate, right? Like, cardiovascular events are rare, and you need to do this for years with, like, 200,000 people. I mean, that's what we're talking about here, and, like, you just don't have that data for, like, any medical intervention, like, ever
Mhm.
besides this, and so, like, I don't know, I guess an interesting question is, you invest so many hundreds of millions of dollars into this data set over decades, and you seem to show a very convincing LDL story. Do you now need to do another randomization of 200,000 people for every new intervention that drops LDL levels? Or are we, at least on some preliminary levels, saying, you know what? We have good evidence that dropping LDL does something. Here are some other things that drop LDL. Yes, ideally, we want like the actual hard outcomes on these interventions too, but it's pretty reasonable.
Well, I mean, the thing is, like, we can kind of definitively say that with statins that hey, we have not only LDL reduction data, but we also have hard outcome data.
Yeah.
Whereas with these other interventions, we have LDL reduction data, but we don't know if that actually translates to hard outcome reduction. And so,
Yeah.
in my opinion, yeah, we do need those trials to actually justify their use outside of just LDL reduction. Because then we have, like, a diabetes issue, right? We have a lot of medications that improve your A1C and bring your sugars down,
Hmm.
but we have very few that actually prevent the hard outcomes for why we treat diabetes to begin with.
But do we have examples of interventions that drop A1C and we have negative data on hard outcomes, or we just don't have those studies? We have like an absence of data on hard outcomes.
Well, I mean, when we look at, like, the most recent network meta-analyses that we've looked at and discussed before, we're seeing that GLP-1 agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors do prevent cardiovascular events, whereas things like sulfonylureas don't.
But is there, I guess my point is like, is there a disconnect with the A1C surrogate, right? Like it's like, well, this reduces A1C just as much, but we see a very different hard outcome difference. Or it's like, well, this intervention is just better at reducing A1C and it's better at reducing heart attacks or diabetes outcome.
So are you kind of asking, like, in the sense of, like, if we standardized it to an A1C reduction, much like this.
Yeah, that's my point. I guess like, so I totally get your point about hard outcomes. Like I am a hard outcome guy. Like totally get it. And major issues with surrogates. And like it took what, 4 decades to randomize 200,000 people,
Mhm.
and if we are comfortable, like the issue with surrogates is 2 things. 1, the absolute effects are usually much smaller on hard outcomes that matter, and 2, it's indirect evidence, right? Like we don't know for sure if reducing that surrogate is always going to lead to the outcome that we want. But if we have pretty convincing data, let's argue for point of sake here, LDL as a decent surrogate, at some level, and it's not the same as having hard outcomes, but we can say, look, we're pretty convinced this is a decent surrogate. And if we have other interventions that reduce this surrogate, like we can have more faith in that. We don't have to wait another 40 years to use it.
Me personally, I prefer having that data that supports that. Like, I'm just being honest. I prefer the data that shows, hey, not only do we get the reduction in the surrogate, but we get the reduction in the hard outcome.
Oh, I agree. But it's like pragmatism too. Yeah.
Pragmatism. So, like, yes, if someone is, like, truly cannot tolerate a statin, right,
Hmm.
or for whatever reason can't take it, and their cholesterol is elevated, and we do know that LDL is associated with an increased risk, and I can do something that can bring that down, yeah, sure, I would consider it then. But otherwise, I would not want to do that.
Okay, I got a question for you.
It wouldn't be my preference.
Here comes a patient. They have strong internal value system against statins and medication. They've got high LDL and they're taking red yeast rice and it is reducing their LDL. Are you fighting them on that? Are you saying it meets your value system, your LDL is lowered based on it before and after rechallenge testing? I'm convinced it's impacting your LDL. I'm comfortable with that.
And we know for a fact that this red yeast rice isn't actually tainted with simvastatin.
Well, it wouldn't matter. I mean, I guess it wouldn't matter, right? Because if they're coming in saying this is the brand that I'm taking and I'm comfortable with it, regardless, and the LDL is dropping, and are you like, well, you know what, dude, we don't have hard outcomes on red yeast rice, and we have to do statin, or you're like, you know what, the LDL is probably a decent surrogate. I want you to know that we have zero hard outcome data on, I believe that's true, on reduced rice. We do have LDL data. It looks like it's impacting yours, but there's stronger evidence with statins. But I know these are your personal preferences.
Sounds like we're doing some shared decision making, Josh.
Yeah, exactly. We shared decision making.
Yeah. Yeah, no, like that's the thing too. Is like remember in evidence based medicine, patient preference and respect to the patient's autonomy is 1/3 of evidence based
Yeah,
medicine, right? And so, of course, I'm going to take that into consideration and talk to them. I'm not there to fight a patient. I'm there to just help them.
yeah. Maybe in your head you're having a different conversation, but with them, yeah. No, so I think that's true and fair. And it's funny, we just have such different patient populations, right? Because I have like, I don't know, I could think of like a dozen off the top of my head just like that. And then what you were texting me the other day, you had like a patient with like a baseline risk of what, like 3%, and they wanted to be on a statin. I'm like, wow, we see different sides of the universe here.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, the worst thing that you could ever do is, I mean, at least in my opinion, is lose a patient because they don't like you, right? Type of thing of, you don't want to argue with a patient and then they mistrust the medical system and they don't get the care that they need. That's a lose-lose situation for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, and if if you're clear with, and not every patient's for every doctor, but like, and vice versa, but like, I don't know, if you're honest with the data and you chart the heck out of it, I don't know, I'm getting more and more comfortable with that.
And I had a really good attending who told me, like, listen, patients are sovereign entities. Like, they can make their decisions. You don't need to force them to do anything.
Yeah, I think,
You've talked to them about risks. You've talked to them about benefits. You've given them like what your opinion is.
yeah,
If they do or do not want to do something, that's ultimately their decision.
I think the pressure is coming, I would posit, from these EMR reminder tick boxes, right? And reimbursements based on like quality assessments, meaning like, getting these levels down. And these are fixable things, right? So and also guidelines. I think like now that we have these guidelines for like everything, it's just the onus is on you to do anything different.
Mhm.
And so I feel like, a lot of times, I mean, it would be great if the incentive structure was such that, did you have an informed consent discussion about statins with the patient? Click the box, yes, okay, you're rewarded. As opposed to, the LDL level or the percentage of your patients on a statin, that meet a certain criteria. Okay, so I have a whole bunch of things in my mind to royal your thought process on this, for future things to discuss. But this was pretty good. We didn't come to fisticuffs. I think we actually believe in the same thing. We just have a different emphasis on it. But at the end of the day, our emphasis is going to stay in our own minds, and we're going to have an informed conversation with the patients anyway. So cool, man. Good conversation. I need to take a break from statins for a while. We got to move on to something completely different next week. I think we have.
Mm. Yeah, no more statins, no more GLP-1 inhibitors.
No, yeah. Although there was a new one.
Or agonists, excuse me, not inhibitors, agonists.
Yeah, there's a new one that just got approved. Was it Mujaro? What is?
Manjaro's not it's a combination of two different things, but it seems like at this point, like if you're a GLP-1 or GLP-1 GIP-1
Uh huh.
agonist and you don't get approved, it's like you really messed up because they're just getting approved left and right.
This one, like the mean weight loss difference is like double the semaglutide studies. Like that's what I've been seeing. I haven't read the full studies yet. I just saw it in a continuing ed class, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's insane. So anyway, did you hear that? Like, because I know we also like to listen to like financial podcasts. Like they're already trying to price in airline stock based on the lower amounts of fuel that they'll need because everyone's going to be skinny now.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's just crazy. Um,
Well, did you hear too that one of the companies, I think it was Novo Nordisk, who are based, I think, in Denmark, actually have a greater like revenue than the total GDP of the actual country.
it's like it's like GLP-1s and Legos. That's the
And all because of the GLP-1. Yeah.
that's their GDP. Oh man, I hope we don't have any Danish listeners. Okay, so well, And we love you. I'm part Danish, so it's okay. It's cool. It's cool. I can say stuff like that.
If you do, we love your country.
All right. We will talk to you next time. Great conversation. Thank you, sir. And next week we have one more listener requested article. The amazing Dr. Garovich wants us to go over this really cool, one of my favorite seminal studies. I think it was in Cell on the microbiome, which I think is kind of neat. So maybe we'll cover that next week.
On the microbiome and statins, it's actually another statin trial.
Oh, for crying out loud. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye. If you enjoy this podcast, chances are that one of your colleagues and friends probably would as well. Please do us a favor and let them know about the podcast. And if you have a little bit of extra time, even just a few seconds, if you could rate us and review us on Apple Podcast or any other distributor, it would be greatly appreciated. It would mean a lot to us and help get the word out to other people that would really enjoy our content. Thank you. Hey, y'all, this is Josh. We talked about some really interesting stuff today. I think one of the things we're going to do that's relevant, there is a course we have on Dr. Journal Club called the EBM Boot Camp that's really meant for clinicians to sort of help them understand how to critically evaluate the literature, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the things that we've been talking about today. Go ahead and check out the show notes link. We're going to link to it directly. I think it might be of interest. Don't forget to follow us on social and interact with us on social media. At Dr. Journal Club, Dr. Journal Club on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera. So please reach out to us. We always love to talk to our fans and our listeners. If you have any specific questions you'd like to ask us about research, evidence, being a clinician, et cetera, don't hesitate to ask. And then, of course, if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on the pod, please let us know as well.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Be sure to visit www.drjournalclub.com to learn more.